All right, we are recording. So thank you all for coming. Tonight's episode of the Princeton Maker Book Club will be featuring two special guests, Nadine Orenstein from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Linn Meyers, artist from Washington, D.C. And to kind of set up our evening, I wanted you all to really focus on how print comes into the world. So print in order for it to exist, has three participants in it. And sometimes it's one person, and sometimes it's two people, sometimes it's three different people or groups of people that bring the print into the world. There needs to be an artist, there needs to be a printer, and there needs to be a publisher. So oftentimes when we think about fine art printmaking, we're thinking about the artist who makes their own plate, who then prints it and then is, selling their wares. And so that at that time, the artist is wearing all three hats. Tonight, we're really going to focus on kind of the publisher at large in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to kind of go over what a publisher is. For many people, you think of publishing, maybe you think of books, or you think of magazines or newspapers, like say the New York Times, you think of a publisher. But in the world of fine art print publishing, publishers are often more involved than say the New York Times, where it's maybe a position that's much more far removed. And so in fine art print publishing, print publishers are really responsible for project development, so selecting artists to work with, project production, figuring out how those projects are going to come into the world. They pay for those things, and they figure out then how they will be disseminated, ultimately sold. For me, this image here of John Sloan, his image, The Amateur Lithographers, really represents a lot of how artists feel when they're making work. In this case, he decided he had borrowed Arthur Dove's press, who he was away, and he thought, well, I can do this lithography thing. And he had a friend, Carl Mollman, come in to help try to teach him some of the basics of printmaking. And this image really encapsulated his concept of the process of printmaking. To give you kind of an idea, he got an edition of 3 before the stone was completely obliterated as far as the image was concerned. And so for me, I like to really show this as one of the reasons that artists love to work with publishers, because they often then find ways for them to work with printers, and it changes the dynamic, allowing all these different parties to do the things that they do the best. The publisher to act as the person who is kind of in charge of the big picture of the project, the printer who's in charge of the technical, and the artist who's in charge of the imagery that's to be produced. One of the sections that's in the book, it's under the relief printing, is Jose Guadalupe Posada, and his publisher, Antonio Venegas Arroyo, was famous for a lot of different things, but the main thing was the broadsheets that he produced at the early part of early 1900s. And so this was a visual as well as written newspaper that usually came out twice a day, sometimes even 3 times a day. And so, being that they weren't using photographs, they had to hand carve all of these images, and they were being relief printed or printed on a letterpress. So Posada, when he started working with Venegas Arroyo and his daily publication, his responsibility to cut blocks that represented the news of the day, common stories, feel-good things, disastrous things. And Venegas Arroyo was one of those publishers who was willing to challenge the status quo. And as a result, his print shop was burned twice by the police, and a lot of the blocks were lost. But the reason I like to show this image, the American mosquito, here to the right, which appeared in a large broadsheet, was that this was the first anti-American propaganda to come out of Latin America, because this image came from an article that was about early American intervention in Cuba. And so this paper was not only talking about its own politics, was talking about global politics and politics of the region within these papers. And it used visual imagery for a population that was partially literate and highly illiterate in order to communicate. And Posada really popularized the skeleton, or the calavera, as a way of being able to represent someone without physically putting their visage in, which could get them in trouble politically, right? So if you wore the hat, in which case, one of the reasons I love this portrait of Venegas Arroyo, it's him as a skeleton, right? And this became the standard, so that popularization of the Mexican skeleton or the calavera really came from Jose Guadalupe Posada. And the image on the left, the person in the middle, that's Venegas Arroyo. And what I loved about this particular image is how it shows all of the different roles within the print shop. And here he is at the center, kind of acting as director or as publisher. And so when you think about someone in terms of the publishing role, that would really be their job, to have all these parts and pieces working together. And so Posada himself, he put himself in the image. And if you look down at the bottom left, you see the skull with the little top, like the little hat on it with the white band. That was Posada himself. That was his own self-portrait as a skeleton. But I love all the different roles and all the different things that are in. There's like the gun that's just lying on the table. It really shows you kind of the feeling of the time of what they were doing. You know, that what they were doing was, it was dangerous in a lot of ways, a lot of the work that they were publishing. And, you know, and kind of in contrast, when you think about print publishing, say in Japan in the 1830s, this is one of the more famous Japanese woodblock prints, you know, commonly called ukiyo-e. The Great Wave is by Hokusai. This is, you know, one of 36 images from the 36 views of Mount Fuji portfolio. And the initial publisher, Yohochi, they printed about 5,000 of these at this time. And one of the things that's really interesting about print publishing, especially more historic versus contemporary, is how often an image would get recycled by other publishers. Sometimes the image would even, you know, be co-opted and someone would carve reproductive blocks. And so this particular print is one of the more reproduced images that's been made from Japan from this period. And it's still being printed today. There are blocks that were recarved, and other publishers are actually still reprinting this particular print today. You can go buy a contemporary version of this one. And so some publishers, when we think of publishing, it's not just this one thing that happens one time, like they publish this suite and that's what they've done. It can be a long-term relationship, and how that role of the publisher can stay with a work, even though the artist and the initial publishers have long since gone. And so if we fast forward to today, like this, you know, when we think of contemporary publishing, this is a shot of Bob Rauschenberg working at Gemini back in 1969. And he's working on, the image is called Waves, and it's from the Stoned Moon series. What I love showing images like this is that far too often, especially nowadays with so much of this being in the digital platform, we see the print, which is there to the right, and you really lose a sense of the scale of the making of something like this. And for me, you know, part of what we are trying to do when we're talking in a format like this is provide that additional context. So it's not just that artists have ideas and that publishers are willing to do them. It's that the combination of that willingness and idea has to take a much higher level into kind of a leap of faith when you're starting to think about contemporary print publishing, the costs of overhead for that. So you see all these different printers who are involved in the studio. You see the scale of that stone. There's the preparation of it. There's the printing of it, all the hands that go into that to make a work that you've paid to produce up front that you don't know if anyone's going to like. And I think, you know, one of the things we really talk about in print publishing is how the publishers really have to have a great deal of faith in the artists that they select, because they're putting their money up first. You know, so when we think about the role of the publisher, that cost of production, it's easy to say, but that's really where a lot of the faith lies. It's that someone's willing to put their hard-earned dollars up to take a risk to allow someone to come into a studio to produce whatever it is that they're going to produce, because you don't really know what it is that they're going to make. You know, and from a more historic perspective, a lot of the time is you were actually commissioning someone to make a specific thing. And so you knew more what you were going to get. And, you know, fast forward to today, it's really about placing that faith and vision of the artist. You know, and Gemini is a really great example of that, because they were really the pioneers in contemporary terms of multi-process and even sculptural work, and then even into sculptural editioning. And I love to show this particular image from the earlier period of Gemini, because this really set the standard of anything goes in contemporary print publishing. You know, Gemini really broke the mold, so to speak, when it came to what an edition is and what's the purpose of an edition. and, allowing an artist to use just about any tools that they had at their disposal. And I like really showing this grouping because if you just look at the finished image, the shot that everybody gets to see, it's even the shot that's in the book, you get a sense of this really interesting image, but you're not necessarily 100% certain what you're looking at. And when you see the side view of it, you can really see the physicality of that car, and then seeing him working on the blank from which the mold was made. It gives you a really different perspective on what it took just to make this. And so when you think about this being done in the late 60s, it's at a time when people are really starting to change their concept of what a print is and what's the purpose of a print. So that's kind of the setup and the stage for a little bit of what we'll be talking about tonight, throughout the night. But I like to do this segment, the one that got away through these talks, where I invite someone to come on and talk about a print or an artwork that they wished they could have gotten, but for whatever reason, and usually we try to get a little bit of the backstory on the reason, they missed it. And because we all have those. And so tonight, Linn Meyers, who's one of the artists represented in the book and an artist that I've worked with on prints recently, the last few years, I'll introduce her work a little bit. She's a multidisciplinary artist. She does site-specific, large format installations. Some of you may have seen her piece at the Hirshhorn Museum between May to May of 2016 to 2017. These pieces are massive and they're ephemeral. She takes several months to build these, or to draw these, and paint these on the walls. And they're usually up for about a year, and then they're gone. They get painted back over. So there's this really intimate interaction of her work with the space. It's designed, it's in a lot of ways a collaboration with the architecture and the architect of the space. And people get to experience that work flowing through it. And so for me, this is like one type of the work that Linn makes, and she's done them at lots of different institutions and continues to do them. But where a lot of this stuff comes from is some of the work in her studio. And I love the translation of studio work to site-specific work, and where you can start to see parallels and connections of things within that. This is a painting. This is a very recent painting. And so, having spent a lot of time with Linn, she can work on paintings for years at a time sometimes. Sometimes that's what it takes for something to resolve itself. And her drawing practice, for me, when you see her paintings and you see like these smaller graph paper drawings, it really helps you understand how she approaches her site-specific work. And a lot of times when you get to see some work from an artist, you only get to see some drawings or see some paintings or see a site-specific piece. You don't get to really see the whole body. And so I try to take a little bit of time to show you guys how she thinks through these different media. And this is a print that was published by Flying Horse Editions. It just came out. It was one that was completed right before the pandemic. So it took a while to actually finish editioning this one. This was actually the last project I worked on before the pandemic started. So this is a really wonderful print if you get a chance to check it out. It's direct reviewer, sugarloaf spit bites, 3 plates. And this is something that Linn and I have been working on, and we just finished it. Just shipped her the prints. Hopefully they arrive today. Actually, they're supposed to. And it's something that we've been working on. So this is a proof. So Linn is an artist who's had many exhibitions, received many awards, things like Paul Krasner. She's been supported by the Smithsonian. She's done a lot of residencies throughout the United States, as well as all these site-specific pieces in different museums like the Hirshhorn and the Phillips Collection and the Columbia Museum, the Hammer. We could go on and on and on about her accolades. So I encourage you to look her up. But what I really wanted her to talk to us about tonight was the piece that got away. And this is by artist Mark Lombardi. So welcome, Linn.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for such a nice introduction.
So what do you want to tell us about how you got exposed to Mark Lombardi's work?
I was thinking back on it. I'm pretty sure that I first encountered his work at Gallery Joe in Philadelphia, who I worked with for a number of years. And my recollection is that his work was in a group show there in the late 90s. And then he died in 2000, and Gallery Joe, I believe, did a solo exhibition of his work after he passed. But it's some of the work that kind of sticks in my head. And, you know, in 1999, when he was in that group show, there's no way I could have even, I mean, it was one of those things like, oh, I wish I could have that, but there was not any money in the budget for art buying. And of course, you know, not long after that, he was gone, and the works skyrocketed in value or in cost, and it was never going to happen for me. But I do love his work. I love the simplicity of it, and yet like the mapping that he does looks so simple, but when you actually examine the data, it's so complicated, and very few people have traced that back in that way. And he established this language in a really short period of time that that took information from news sources and spelled it out in this really elegant visual manner.
When you first brought him up, I was trying to remember, I was like, I know this name. I was trying to remember the work. And then I looked up his work. And the thing that struck me the most was how his work seemed like a cerebral version of your work. Like you're an even more visual representation. Having spent so much time working with you and where your work comes from, like all these events and experiences of the day and how that informs the work that you're making and how you start a piece and how it carries through. Yours is the pure visual and his seems to be the pure empirical. You guys seem almost like bookends from one another. So when I saw this particular drawing, it just made sense on a whole other level, similar to conversations that we've had with you about how your work and in relation to Robert Irwin's work from your site specific works perspective.
Yeah.
You know, how yours is like picks up where his leaves off, where because of how you both use the space, where his ends up being about the space with nothing in it. Yours,
right, the air.
yours fills that space. Like, but
Yeah.
it starts with a similar response. And so I just found that was really fascinating that it seemed like you guys were kindred spirits from like opposite ends of the same thread.
I mean, with Lombardi, he's like, I don't know what his process was, but when you really examine the work, and some of these are very large, I imagine that he did a ton of mapping out prior to beginning the large pieces, and which is true of my site specific work. But you know, I think his process had to have been more predetermined than, or maybe like multiple sketches to get to this place, than the way I work, which is, you know, is so process based. But you're right. I mean, we're both mapping.
Right. And I think, you know, I'm not sure if anyone else sees that, but just having spent so much time working with you, the minute I saw this, it just like, it made total sense to me on why this was something that you really wished you could have had. Because it's in so many ways, you guys are speaking about similar things. And there's that similar kind of grace to your work.
And most of the work that I have in my collection is not work that's similar to what I do. So this would be an outlier. One that got away.
It's the one that got away. Exactly. And so, yeah, so for me, you know, if anybody's interested in looking up more of Mark's work, you know, it's really sad that he passed when he did. He wasn't that old. But what you'll see are a lot of precursors to a lot of social movements and social awareness today. He was really in a lot of ways trying to help people understand why things are the way they are from a macro perspective by showing how things are connected, so people could understand how business drives the global economy and what those parts and pieces are. And he did it in this way that gives you all of the information, but allows you to kind of spend some time with it to reach it or read it, rather than just like beating you over the head with all of the facts. It lets you kind of digest it in a way and see how everything is connected. It's really graceful work. And I was really happy that you brought it back up, because I had forgotten about it. It was one of those things when, you know, if it's not in front of you all the time, it's easy to forget about it. But it was
Yeah.
really nice to get to see his work again.
Yeah, he's a great artist. Really, really interesting work. Really elegant. Yeah, good stuff.
And right now, I believe Pierogi Gallery, Joe Amron is the one who represents the estate. So if you guys are interested in looking into Mark's work more, that would be the first stop to go check some of that out. And Linn has new editions available through Flying Horse Editions. I want to mention too, and wanted to ask you a little bit about it since we're talking about publishers today here. You've done work with the Tamron Institute as well as Flying Horse Editions. For you, what are you looking for in a publisher from the artist's perspective? What's the thing that makes that a working situation for you?
Great master printers, great collaborative printmakers. I started out as a printmaker and quickly realized that that was not going to work well. I don't follow rules very well, and printmaking requires a kind of rule following. It was sort of a dream of mine to be able to work with a publisher and a master printer. And lo and behold, I get to do that now. It's amazing. And to work with printmakers who will try anything and will, go do crazy stuff to make an image, to sort of channel what they hear coming out of the artist and what they know about the artist's work, to really tease out, well, the way that we did together at Flying Horse starting in 2019, where you knew my work and really, introduced me to processes that I hadn't visited in a long time. And we ended up making this super painterly image, which, I had done a number of residencies at the Tamron Institute, and I've worked with other publishers also, but I hadn't been exploring etching in that way ever. And that was such a treat. It was amazing. And also, the other thing about a great publisher is that they get your work out there. So they have a platform.
Right. Yeah. And I think, that the fact that there's more than one of things and they have an ability to place them in several places at the same time is something that really, for a lot of artists, is really attractive because it helps amplify and multiply their voice. For you, working in print, have you seen an effect for your general marketplace as an artist having worked in print?
Well, one of the things I love about printmaking is that because you're making multiples, of course the price is lower. And, I have a complicated relationship with the commercial side of things. And by making prints, I always have work that I can donate to auctions and also offer to younger collectors who are just starting out. So, that's one of the things that I really love about it is that it's much more accessible than a big painting like the one behind me. So.
Right. Yeah. That accessibility and portability, I think, is one of the key drivers of why prints have remained relevant for so long and important to an artist's career. Not just the fact that you get that time with printers, and it's kind of in some ways a personal artistic indulgence when you get to work with some other people and really push the way in which you're thinking about your own work and get to try something new in a supported way. But then there's that other effect for your work.
Yeah, and there's always that experience of being out of the studio in a shop, working with other people. It's so different than the energy when you're alone in your studio. And then, coming home, coming back to painting and bringing all this new information with me, all these new ideas from, explorations that I did with other talented people.
So would you say for you that printmaking changes the way you see your work at all?
the way I see my work.
Mhm.
I see it more as a, you know, a facet and a tool, the way I draw and I paint and I work with architecture. So it's just part of that holistic approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any parting thoughts for us before we move on to the next segment? Because I appreciate your time tonight.
I am a huge fan of your book. I think everybody who cares about printmaking should have a copy. That's all I have to say.
I appreciate that. That was very kind. And thanks. And stick around. There may be some questions for you later too. What we'll be moving on to next is kind of a segment I refer to as a deeper look, where we dive a little bit further into some aspect in the book. And one of the things that's brought up very briefly, it's actually, you know, like that's one paragraph in the brief history of print, is that of the early days of print publishing. And we have someone who happens to be a scholar on that particular period of time, one of the more knowledgeable people in the world about this topic, who is Nadine Orenstein, who's the Drew Hines curator in charge of the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and someone who I can honestly say that every time I have a conversation with you, Nadine, about this period of time, I learn a great deal. And it's something that I've always loved, and I'm grateful for you to share your thoughts with us today. So I'll stop my screen share so you can share yours.
Thanks so much, Phil. And I always learn a lot or think a lot talking to you. And now let me find my PowerPoint. Hold on. I think. Let's see. There we go. All right. Can you see that?
Yep.
All right. Oh, except it's at the end. There we go. So, you know, I don't know if you want to ask me questions, or I'll go through my slides and then we can chat after. But
I would say go ahead and go through your slides first, and then we'll.
Yeah. Okay, I chose a bunch of slides to talk about Hieronymus Koch. So Hieronymus Koch was sort of the big print publisher in the mid 16th century in Antwerp in the Netherlands, present day Belgium. And he was really, although people had published prints before him, he was really the one who, like, you know, sort of envisioned the business. And he thought of it in a big way. And he did all the things that, you know, Phil laid out at the beginning: product development. Well, I can't remember your 4 points, but as you were talking, I was like, yeah, that's exactly what he was doing. I mean, you know, I wrote my dissertation, my PhD, on a 17th century Dutch print publisher. And as I was working on it, it just kept striking me how, like, very little has changed today from the way it was in the 16th, 17th century. So what I'm showing you here is a print by one of the printmakers who worked for Hieronymus Koch. But actually, the reason I show it to you, it's part of a big series of prints that are just these views of kind of imaginary city. But on the corner of this town is Hieronymus Koch's print shop. And so what you can see is here is his wife, Vulcan Dierks, who we know, and he's standing here in the doorway, and they're, you know, in the shop. And actually, I don't know if you can see, but if you look very closely back here, there's all sorts of things on the shelves, like, you know, albums of prints and things like that on the shelves. And then at the very top, on the cornice here is the name of his print shop, the Four Winds. So you see 4 little eyes and then the word vent, aux quatre vents, which is the name of his very famous publishing shop. And then at the bottom, there's actually an inscription that says, in Dutch, that says, "Laat de kok koken om het volk." I can't remember, Vulcan. Anyway, it's sort of like a play on his name, on her name. So it's very clearly like making reference to his own publishing shop. And he was quite well known in his day. But he started out, you know, at a moment when there were a lot of individual printmakers around in the Netherlands. They were very prolific woodcut publishers of woodcuts who were making like cheap prints that you could use from everything as a from an artwork to like the thing that goes under the candle when you're putting out a votive candle in a church that would have a little woodcut on the bottom. So like woodcuts were being used for everything. And he realized like, I'm going to work on etching and engraving and make a high quality artwork that would appeal to an intellectual audience and really and figure out how to like circulate these things all over Europe. So he thought from the very beginning, he thought big. He was a printmaker himself, and these are two prints by him that are from early in his career, 1550, that's really when he gets going, and they show Roman ruins. And there is some question about whether he actually went to Rome, or more likely he was using somebody else's sketches that he was making these prints from. But what it shows is he's already thinking about like what was popular at the time in terms of imagery, and Italy was the big thing. And his like the focus of his publishing at the beginning was like everything Italian, from Roman ruins to views of the Sistine Chapel to works by Italian artists. So and I'll just show you one thing. I'm going to blow up this picture, and the reason I did it is to show like this is very early in his career as an etcher. And you can see, if you're, I'd say, Phil, maybe you have some thoughts on looking at this thing, but it's sort of a wreck, right? The ground has cracked and there's like ink all over. So maybe the plate isn't like flat.
It definitely has some what we refer to as plate anomalies.
Yes. So I'd say these are beginner mistakes. And oh dear, sorry. These are beginner mistakes, and these are the things that you know, I think you don't see this in his work later on. Maybe he gets much more accomplished printmakers to work for him who know what they're doing instead of him trying to figure out how to make an etching. But he really is like he not only like makes popular imagery, but he works with the best artists available of his day and the best printmakers who are available. So he wants high quality work. So he brings in artists from Italy, like Giorgio Ghisi. The print on the left is Ghisi's print after Bronzino, and Ghisi does, and you can see that this is like a 2-sheet plate, enormous. And that's another thing that he does, is he does either huge series of prints, like 25 you know, at a time, or big, like 2 or 3 sheets pasted together. And you know, Ghisi was a really accomplished printmaker from Italy. He brings him up, he's an engraver, and he gets just Ghisi working on doing images of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, doing all kinds of works after famous Italian painters. Then Ghisi decides to go back to Italy. And you can tell, you know, if you sort of look at the work, and you can, you know, you got to read between the lines. There's not a lot of documents relating to what was actually going on in the print shop, but it seems pretty clear, like these things were so popular that all of a sudden he realized, oh my God, I need somebody who's going to be able to do that stuff, because I don't have anybody, and who's going to do it. So he looks to the printmakers who did the thing on the right, which is an etching plate by these artists, Jan and Lucas Dudecum, who are like professional etchers. And he clearly is trying to get them to fill the slot, you know, left open by Ghisi, but they are not that good at doing this, the dark and light, very punchy, you know, like the equivalent of an engraving. That's not their strength. They were prolific etchers who did great work. But it looks to me like when you start looking over the whole body of work, that he gave him a shot and it's like, you know what, this is not your thing. You can see the print is a little funny looking, it gets a little muddy, it's not as sharp, and they couldn't get the really dark, deep blacks that Ghisi was able to get in this very strong contrast. They were trying, but I think their print gets a little muddy, and something strange about it. We had it up in an exhibition this past year that we did on etching. So so they move on, but you can see that he's thinking, it seems to me, you can see that he's thinking like, what each artist's role is, what printmakers do well, what they don't do well, who they might work with well. Let's see. Okay. And this is just to make the point that he does big things. This is those same printmakers, Jan and Lucas van Dudecom, but this time they're working after clearly a drawing, not a painting, and a very clear drawing that doesn't have a lot of, shading, different shades and tones, and they do an excellent job. This is huge. This is part from a book, but it's a plate that folds out, and maybe you can see it's at least, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, I don't know, 4 or 5 sheet plates long. It's like if you get, 2 tables put end to end, it would take up all of that space. And this is only one plate in a book that has at least 4 or 5 of these very long things showing, not life size, but really giving the breadth of what the baths of Diocletian look like. And then here again to show like big things, he was also making maps. This is a huge wall map, also made of like 6 sheets of paper pasted together, plus the border is from a separate set of plates that were printed and made that sort of decorative border all around. And this is kind of a fun early map of the Americas, which is more really about the water than it is about and the coastline than it is about what was going on in the middle of the Americas at the time. And then this again is the Dudecom brothers. So this is just to make the point that not only is he working with like the best printmakers, and these guys were like, praised by contemporaries, and even long after they were gone, their etching was thought to be like, fantastic. But here they're working after Cornelis Florus, who was one of the great sculptors and ornament designers of the time. So again, it's like pairing the best artists with the best printmakers. And then he's probably best known for working with Peter Bruegel. And Bruegel was a painter when he starts out really working as a designer of prints for Hieronymus Koch. And he does, before his career really takes off as a painter, he's clearly earning money making these kinds of designs. So the print on the right is sort of typical of the kinds of things you see Bruegel doing early in his career. And these are kind of prints inspired by Hieronymus Bosch. This is a print of Sloth, and you can see a sloth. She's sitting there in the center, sleeping on top of like a very lazy donkey, and there's like incredible, like, how could she be sleeping with all of this going on around her? It's like this wild, hell scene raging around her. And these things, so he does a whole series of all the different vices, and this is one of them. And these were incredibly popular at the time, just based on how often you see, how you see them in every print room, and the plates really printed over and over and over again. The print on the right, though, or the left, though, is interesting because that's a print by Bruegel himself. Now, he wasn't a printmaker. He made one print, and that is it. This one etching, and it's rather late. It's 1560. The print of Sloth is a bit earlier than that. So he was already had a career, and obviously very successful career, making designs for prints for somebody else to engrave. So that print of Sloth was engraved by printmaker Peter van der Heyden, but I get the feeling Hieronymus Koch sort of encouraged his very popular designers to make at least one print, and probably this was good for Bruegel at this point. It was sort of, he was really trying to get his painting career to take off. He did like painted landscapes. So this was sort of a way of showing people what he could do as a more serious artist, and not Hieronymus Bosch II over there on the right. So this is a beautiful etching that was done by Bruegel himself, and it really looks a lot like his drawings. It's this beautiful kind of almost impressionist style that he does with little flicks for the trees and little and it's again this what he was known for, these what we call world landscapes, where you have kind of a big mountain in the foreground, and then it dips down and winds its way well into the background, into the far distance, where this, you can see even all the way in the back a church, boats. He really has so much detail in these prints. And then in the foreground, also very typical for Bruegel, is a proverb, so being acted out. So there's a hunter with a crossbow who's aiming his crossbow at, there's two little bunnies in front of him. And then there's a hunter or somebody with a spear kind of coming around the back of the tree. Looks like he's hunting the hunter. So who's being hunted? Is it the rabbits? Is it the hunter? And there are various proverbs of the time that kind of play off on that theme. Then I just wanted to make the point about the difference in sort of, I don't know if you call it temperament, or just the, like, Hieronymus Cook was working with lots of different artists, and I was talking to Phil the other day, and I was like, things haven't changed. Different artists have different levels of interest in what's going on, levels of dedication. So here are two artists who are very prolific designers of prints for Hieronymus Cook about the same time. On the left is Franz Flores, who was a well-known painter in his day. And on the right is a wonderful drawing by Peter Bruegel of Faith, again from a series of virtues this time. And you can see how different the kinds of drawings these guys made for print. So Flores, he just did this very loose, very open drawing. It's indented, which means that it was traced for transfer onto a printing plate. So we know this is the drawing that was used to make an engraving. And I'll show you what it looks like in a second. And the same thing for Bruegel's drawing. But you can see, like, Franz Flores really is leaving a lot of the translation of his drawing up to the printmaker, whereas Bruegel is making darn sure that that printmaker is going to follow every single line he makes, because you get the feeling he's a little of a control freak. So here are the prints that were made after both of those, and they're sort of very similar kinds of prints in the end, engravings, and but you can see how different the beginnings were. And I think that's it. So happy to chat now. That's kind of like the general idea. So maybe I'll take the screen share off.
Thanks for that. I love seeing the drawings that were used. And one of the things to point out is they're backwards, the prints, from the drawings, obviously, but it's one of those things that's really wonderful to see the thing that actually was the basis for the later print, because you really get that it was drawn in this direction, intending to be viewed in the opposite. So the artist was having to work backwards in that regard. And so
I should just say, let me just, before, sorry to interrupt, but also if you noticed on the bottom of the Bruegel drawing, there was an inscription. And, it's not just that there are two people involved in this, the designer and the printmaker. There's also like somebody doing the inscription who's somebody totally different. Maybe it was Hieronymus Cook who added it. Maybe it was a poet that he hired. And so there's a lot of people who have their hands on this thing before the final product is made.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of those things just kind of bring back the conversation that we had before, and to touch on what you were saying, that, Hieronymus Cook's, like, kind of his genius at the time was pairing the right people together. And that was kind of revolutionary in a lot of ways, because so many workshops were, this is this person and they make this type of work, and whoever comes to that printer to make the work, you're going to kind of get what you get, whether or not it matches. And what he was really focused on was a specific end product of being of a certain quality, reaching a certain audience, as well as kind of more mass dissemination. And so he recognized the value of pairing the right people together. And that to me was just a really fascinating thing, because when you're thinking about the 1550s, you're not necessarily thinking about such a global community, and he was, and he was really thinking about that as
Well,
his
also,
audience.
he was in a place that had like all the talent. It was a unique place and moment. So if he had been working, 50 years later, it wouldn't have been the same thing because everybody spread out. The Reformation came through, the iconoclasm, everybody left. But here he was in a moment where there was just like the great artists. It was a port city, so a lot of art was coming in. There were great patrons there. It was just like this incredible merging of like great intellectuals. So we had an audience, a ready audience, and the talent and the printmakers. Like it was just like a moment that didn't happen again.
Yeah, I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about kind of his beginnings too? Because I think that part of the story is really fascinating.
Yeah, well, he came from a family of artists, so I think he was going to be trained as an artist. His father was an artist, his brother was an artist, and then I think he may have gone down to Italy. We don't know, but he came back and he just I don't know. I don't think we know a huge amount about his beginnings beyond that, but he really kind of saw there was an opportunity there. And he started making prints, but realized like he's not the printmaker. He could get people to do it much better than he could.
I find that, there's a lot of parallels to that particular thing in contemporary print publishing, where you have someone who was trying to be an artist and make a go of it, or working as a printmaker themselves or a printer, and realize that their best skill was actually in organizing everything and putting people together and bringing the collectors in at the right time. And it takes, I think, a great presence of personality to realize that you're not necessarily that good at it, and to hand it over to people who are better. That was one of the things that I thought was really wonderful, and like learning more about him from you, was that he was willing to put the art first. Like that was really the focus.
Yeah, well, he was clearly a good businessman, and realized he was good at that side of the thing. And then the other thing I should say is he was in a city where like the greatest book publisher of the time was also active, Christophe Plantin. And maybe some of you have been to Antwerp and been to the Plantin Moretus Museum, where you can tour the shop that still like survives in the 17th, 16th century, and you can see what it looked like, how it was all set up. But sometimes Hieronymus Koch sometimes kind of paired up with Plantin to use his roots of sending prints around the world. If he needed letterpress text, I'm sure he went over to Plantin and said, yeah, I need some text, to put on my engravings, because you needed different kinds of presses to make letterpress text. So, it was it was a world where everybody helped out other, you can see they're all helping each other. And there's a friend of mine named Karen Bowen who works in Antwerp, in Belgium, and she knows like everything about print circulation in the 16th century, and has been working on figuring out the trade routes that printmakers or print publishers would use to send their prints to the Frankfurt Book Fair, to Italy, and how they paired up, and really you can see them. So-and-so's got a shipment going to Frankfurt, and he picks up like everybody else's shipments and sends them all together. So there's a lot of kind of people working together and, paying each other to help out. And, it's a small world there, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that kind of stuff still happens today amongst a lot of publishers. We trade stuff off and help one another out in that regard, which to me, some of those things that's just so impressive as a contemporary print publisher myself, and working with a lot of other print publishers, is exactly how similar the process that we use today was to what he set up, what he pioneered. When it comes to even if you have your own studio, but maybe there's a portion that you don't specialize in, and how you contract out to another printer or another publisher to actually help you finish a project, and how we work together in that regard, or pool other craftspeople's specific skills and capabilities in order to produce something different. You know, because we were talking about, you know, one of the kind of easily relatable situations was the early days of Gemini out in Los Angeles, and how when they had artists coming into their studio wanting to do different things, they reached out to the network of craftspeople who made things for the movie industry. You know, so that Oldenburg print profile airflow, they reached out to, you know, resin casters who were doing things for film industry, you know, in order to help him achieve this thing that was print kind of sculpture, this thing that lived in between. You know, and so when we were talking, there was that direct correlation to how Hieronymus Koch was thinking about, oh, well, this person who does this thing over this part of town, and you know, how he arrived at something that was obviously workable, because we still do a lot of everything the same way. You know, so for you, how much, you know, when you're doing your research, like what's part of your process of trying to find, like, where are you looking to find more information about how, like, this stuff actually happened back then? Because I think that's a fascinating thing for people to know, like, how you actually find this information.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. Luckily, someone wrote a dissertation in 1977 about Hieronymus Koch, so that helps a lot. But you know, it's really, there is very little information. So maybe you find, like when I was working on my dissertation on this 17th century publisher who's not very well known, but you know, there was one letter where he was asking about dedicating a print to a special person, but that's like so unusual to find a letter written by your person, you know, and crazy. So, and even, you know, famous artists like Peter Bruegel, very little information about him and his life. So in a way, for the art historian, it's more fun because you can start like being detective and looking at their work and trying to tease out bits of information that might give you a bigger picture. But you know, you'll never be able to prove that you're right, you know, for sure. But it presents a little puzzle. So you know, what I often do is like lay out all of the work they did, and you know, chronologically, and then you can kind of see the trends and sorts of things. And you know, and once you work on an artist at a certain point, you kind of get to know them well because you've been looking at them so closely. And so, for instance, when I was working on my dissertation on this one artist, you know, I had been thinking, you know, he was also a little bit like in the vein of Hieronymus Koch. He kind of covered a lot of different kinds of subject matter. He worked with different artists. He had a lot of material, and he was sort of the kind of a print publisher that like someone would walk into a shop and they'd say, oh, I need a view of Rome, or I need some images of animals or whatever, and he would like find them. he had a little bit of everything. And but what I found funny is I've been, you know, for 2 years that I was working on him, like he didn't have a print of the tables, you know, Moses and the 10 Commandments, which was sort of a standard thing that if you were a print publisher and that was something like definitely people had on their wall, he should have had that, and I just never saw it. And it wasn't until like well into working on this, I went to the print room in Copenhagen and they had it. And I just felt like, wow, I was right. You know, I know this guy. So it's fun.
Yeah, he would have had this, and he did.
I knew he had to have it. Maybe it had disappeared, but it just like confirmed, like, okay, I know who this guy is.
And one of the things I thought was interesting that you were telling me about, you know, was that first image you showed that had his shop in it, is that what's in the shop is artwork, not printing presses, because that was really his focus, was the work itself, wasn't necessarily him having to produce it. And, you know, when I see that etching that he worked on, that was kind of, you know, it wasn't the best. It was obvious that he had some issues with it, that that early point when he realized that his efforts were best spent at getting the work made and selling it and distributing it, you know, you can kind of almost imagine like his print shop equipment, like being sold, being shipped out to make room for more art. You get that kind of sense with it, and especially seeing, you know, how meticulous he was at trying to achieve the finest quality of prints, which is why he was working with people who were just better at it than he was.
Yeah,
You know,
and probably like those people were the ones who had the printing press and were making the prints, and he just, I mean, basically what you see there is a shop where he's selling things, and that's what was going on there. And the other thing I would just say about Bruegel is, I was telling you, you know, in terms of like figuring out who an artist is that, you know, we did an exhibition some time ago about Peter Bruegel's drawings and prints at the Met, and so I was like, again, laying out like all the prints and the drawings together, and you could see he starts out working with those etchers that I was talking about, the Dudecombe brothers, and he does one series with them, and then he doesn't do prints with them after that, and you get the feeling that maybe Hieronymus Koch decided, you know, there was you know, and you can see like in the one existing drawing that Bruegel did that was reproduced by them, it's got a lot of like retouchings and fixing in it, which is very unusual for the other drawings. So like something happened there. I don't know what it is, but something was not working. So then he gets, so immediately he starts working with this other guy who's maybe not as talented, but he follows everything Bruegel does. So it's like, okay, you guys will work well together because you're going to do very detailed drawings and he's going to do it, follow every single line. And you can tell after Bruegel dies, that same engraver does another print after a Bruegel design. And it doesn't have like the sharpness of detail that the earlier ones do. Like the guy's hair is sort of lopsided, like things, there's like weird misunderstandings throughout the print. And so then you go back and you think like, wow, Bruegel must have been standing right over him, making sure that he did everything correctly. And the minute he was gone, like the whole thing falls apart.
right, yeah, because I mean, I can speak to that from experience myself, that some artists need to touch everything in a really specific way, and it's your job to, as a collaborating printer and as a publisher, to provide the experience that helps them make their best work as an artist. And, you know, understanding that, that's really interesting. One of the questions that someone had that just came through was how much license did the printers, like the engravers or the etchers, really have in the work? And so what we're hearing from you is it's really artist dependent. Is that right?
You know, it depends. Like, I think there were no models. It was like they were making it up as they went along. So it really depended on who the people were. And so like in the case of Franz Flores, who did that very loose drawing, like he, I think, didn't care so much what the prints looked like. He was interested in the like picture, you know, and what the story was. And he said, like, you guys just do it. You know, here's my drawing, you do it. And you get the feeling he wasn't standing there at all. He was, you know, making his paintings in the other room. You know, it's just different. People probably had different relationships, you know.
Yeah, and a different sense of what they needed to control in the process versus what they were willing to let go to others.
Yeah, and you know, it's the one thing that is different is, you know, this question how much this stuff was considered art. You know, these were like he was doing Franz Flores was doing a series of allegories of the senses, the five senses, and then he'd do an allegory of the arts, and you know, it was, these things were collected. They were partly collected because of the you know, the subject matter and the poems that came attached. You know, they weren't necessarily things that were going on the wall. They were certainly not very experimental at all. They were high quality, well done, but they weren't, like, in terms of printmaking, very unusual.
Yeah, I mean, and we kind of have to put this into context for people. This is the beginnings of a larger population of people being able to own imagery of any kind, really. You know,
Yeah.
for the longest time, it was paintings, drawings owned by a really specific, super wealthy class. And once printing came in this way, and it became possible for people to afford prints, which is still, you know, a big part of printmaking today, that then they, you know, this was the first images being able to go out and being able to be put into people's lives in many ways. So would you, I mean, you know, one of the things too that I think is really interesting to talk about is his wife and her role in the studio and her role taking it on. And it'd be good, I think, to really mention her in this at this stage too.
Yeah, so his wife was named Folken Dirks, which is spelt in a much more complicated way than it sounds, and it has lots of X's and K's in it. And she was clearly his business partner, and you saw her standing there in the shop, and people feel that she really had like a very important role in this publishing house, even though his name is on everything, as it always is, right, ladies? Right. You know, so but she took over the publishing company at the end after he died. So he died, I believe, in 1560, and she took over, or 1570, sorry. She took over and then changed the name of the publishing, or she didn't change the name of the publishing. It was always called In the Four Winds, Aux Quatre Vents, but whereas while he was alive, his name is on every print and not the name of that house. So it says Hieronymus Koch, or Koch, on all the prints. Minute he dies, it says Aux Quatre Vents, at the Four Winds. And I should say, women were very present in the like printmaking industry in the Netherlands, at least in the 16th, 17th century. They were, you know, being trained by their fathers. There's a famous printmaker named Magdalena van de Passa, who was working in Utrecht in the 17th century, who was a really well-known printmaker in her day. There were a number of women who, either widows who took over their husbands' shops, and obviously had been very involved in their print shop at the time. And so it is a business where you get a lot of women in the 16th, 17th century involved in that business.
Right, which, you know, I think is a really important thing to point out too, that it was a family business, that it was this sort of partnership where they relied on one another a great deal in order to cater towards a new audience, you know, so, and a new class of socioeconomic class of citizenry. We got a question here from someone who wants to know the name of the artist publisher that you did your dissertation on.
Oh, his name is, he's not famous. His name is Hendrik Hondius, Hondius. There is a famous map making family named Hondius, and that has a Hendrik Hondius, who is alive at the same time. That's not him. He was in another town in The Hague. And he was just, you know, I wrote there's a book out that's hard to find now, but it's called Hendrik Hondius and the Business of Prints in 17th century Holland, which was my dissertation, published long ago. And, but there was something else I was going to say. One other thing we should point out, which you kind of alluded to earlier, was that these printing plates were not editioned the way plates are now. So they didn't do 100 and then that was it. These plates were value, like that was part of the value of your business. And so Hieronymus Koch dies, Folken Dirks, that's part of her property, is these plates, and then she sells them to somebody else, and then they print them. And some plates could be printed, you know, a century or longer after the artist, the publisher, everybody was gone. People might still be printing them. And so, and they would, you know, cross out or erase the name of the publisher and put their own name in that place. Sometimes they would rework the whole printing plate, because obviously they start wearing down at a certain point. So they would go over and maybe, you know, change the subject, even make it more relevant. You know, you have an image of the king at the time, but, you know, 100 years later, you got a different king. So you'd like take out the face, put a new one in, and then give him like a, you know, a new ruffle around his, you know, around his collar or something. And so that happened all the time.
I mean, yeah, one of my favorite things of learning about early lithography was how often old intaglio plates that were wearing out were printed on retransfer paper and transferred to a litho stone to then be touched up on the stone to continue the life of that image when the intaglio plate could no longer handle it, because that image was just so popular and so valuable.
Yeah.
And so it's something that when we think about the value of prints today, so much of it's about how it is limited rather than the value being its unlimited nature, really, like that, how much can we get out of it? It's that kind of flip of value perception, which is really pretty fascinating. So another, this is kind of a really good point to mention the Goya exhibition that just opened at the Met, because Goya's plates, most of those series were actually printed, their full editions, posthumously, and they have been on subsequent rounds of restrike after restrike after restrike. I think what Los Caprichos is up to like 10 restrikes or something like that. And you can really see the wear in the plates on those later editions, but they're still being produced because they're still so popular, and
obviously that's not what's in our show.
Nope.
We have the early ones and
Exactly.
a beautiful selection of drawings. I should say the Met has the best collection of Goya drawings outside of Spain, and so this is really a wonderful opportunity to see some of those. And also we have some loans from Spain. It's a fantastic exhibition that's on through May 2nd. I didn't work on it. My colleague Mark McDonald, who's curator in our department at the Met, who's a specialist in Goya, among other things, he did the exhibition, and it's really, if you're in New York, if you can get to New York, it's really worth seeing. It's not a show not going anywhere else, so this is the moment to see it, and there's a wonderful catalog too.
Right, that's one of those things that I'm hoping to try to be able to get to New York from Asheville before it comes down. I know, yeah, get in your car, bubble, go see it, go right home.
Catch your vaccine on the way up and get the second shot on the way back.
Yeah, go ahead and get it. Because, for me, Goya really, in the print world, it's really, he's that person who is the beginning of modernism, where what we think of the role of the artist in modern society, and the last of the old masters. I really love that, how he is really looked at. And for all of us print geeks out there, there's a lot of historians who believe that had he never done his Los Caprichos series, he would probably have been a forgotten Spanish artist. That it was really when he dove headlong into making these series of intaglio prints throughout his life that something flourished in him as an artist, that he went to another place that he never went back from. And I think that's a really great inspirational point for a lot of artists out there, that there's kind of almost at any point that your dedication to your craft can really evolve you as a person in a way that makes your work part of a longer arc of conversation about art and about what's important about art over time. Because he was doing that, that shift of, instead of everything being, allegorical to the time, he was just started drawing the time, and this is before photography even. And so I think that's what's really important about that transition, is that he was really talking about his time through his time, rather than, talk about a Greek tragedy that's supposed to relate to this thing that's going on today.
It's very relevant for today. And also the show is really about how he thinks through certain themes through the graphic arts, drawing and print. And he's like working on certain kinds of subject matter in lots and lots of different ways. Different aspects of a certain subject, and how he brings that out in his drawings and in his prints, give him like sort of the opportunity to do this, because they're really very personal in many ways.
Right. I mean, and there's a nice kind of parallel to the value of print to an artist's career between Bruegel and Goya, in the sense that Hieronymus Koch made it possible by hiring Bruegel to do all these print designs to really promote himself as an artist. And there's that stat, it's something like he did like 43 paintings. Bruegel did like 43 paintings of his whole life, and 35 of them were done in the last 5 years of his life, because he gained enough notoriety through all of these print designs to be able to afford to be a full-time painter. Because a lot of, it's easy to think about, paint today, like I can go buy some paint. It's not crazy expensive, but at that time, it's like you're having to make your paint, you're having to do everything. And it was a much more expensive endeavor to be a painter in the middle 1500s than it is today. It's not that it's not expensive to be a painter today, because it still really is expensive today too. But in that time, it was the prints that really created a market for his paintings that allowed him to get his name out there, because he did so many designs for prints.
Well, I think, well, it had its it was double-sided. People knew his name, but they knew him as the second Bosch. So they knew him for that Bosch stuff, which was, I think, not what he wanted to be known for. He wanted to be known for his serious, mysterious landscapes, which is what that etching that he does is. But yeah, he made a name for himself, but he really made a name for himself sort of for the, stuff he was, doing for the market, or
stuff he was eating on. So
it's like caricature, people who are well known for caricatures really always want to be serious artists. And David Levine has a huge body of serious artwork, paintings, watercolors, but everybody wants to see those caricatures. That's the thing that everyone knows about. And that's been like that for centuries. Daumier, same problem. Yeah.
Exactly. There's a question here. I'm going to read it off to you. It says, I was interested in the disparity of print worth to other types of art, as seen in the Met exhibit showing the worth of a work according to how many cows it would cost. So, I think it's a great question to ask.
A reference to there's a little exhibition, I think it's still on at the Met, where they took different kinds of art objects, and then it's called relative values. And so their kind of value was how many cows, or half a cow, and I can't remember, they have a Dürer print in the show, and I can't remember it's half a cow or a quarter of a cow, but in general, prints were really cheap, depending on what they were. So a woodcut could be very inexpensive, and that's why you see woodcuts being used for so many different kinds of things that are just stuff you would have around the house. Whereas a Dürer print was probably a bit higher on the level, but we really have very few indications of price actually from the time. So we're sort of making estimates based on one or two bits of evidence that we've got. But yeah, I think in general they were on the cheap side. I would say Hieronymus Koch's prints were probably a little bit more expensive, just given the kinds of people they were being sold to, and some of these things, and the fact that they're so big, many plates, very working with the best artists. You get the feeling that those must have been selling for a bit more money.
Yeah, you definitely with the scale issue, because just the cost of the material, the metal to work on in and of itself was so high when you were going that big, and the equipment to work with and all that would definitely have been much, much more expensive, especially when you think of a lot of older prints, where there's no border, it's right to the edge. Paper was also in and of itself, but yes, it was more accessible, but it still wasn't dirt cheap.
Also, we should say, in comparison to what we saw from Gemini, they didn't have those huge presses at the time. And so you see, and they had sort of not huge plates, certain sizes. So basically what they would do for if they're going to make a print that size, is they made lots of plates and sheets that would then be pasted together to make one big print.
Yeah, I know from the early days of Gemini, when the artists kept wanting to do bigger things, they had to keep making more and more custom equipment in order to accommodate it. So I know Ken Teller had to have that press made in order to accommodate a stone of that scale, just because, you get the feeling with Hieronymus Koch too, that when the artists are asking for things, the publisher doesn't want to say no, right? Because you're oh, that's a great idea. We want to say yes. We got to figure out a way to say yes. And I know for Gemini, it was in those early days, especially, and it's still to today, when you think of the Julie Meritus that they're making with the work we're doing with Julie right now, how big that is. They're maxing out their equipment, and then but they're still using that same approach of tiling sheets of paper together because they're just so big, right? Because there is a limit to like what your equipment can actually do, but that's not necessarily the limit of what the artist wants. And so yeah, they've got these massive etching presses, but that's still not even big enough for the work that she's wanting to do. There was a question that someone put in too that was about are there many women publishers today? And the answer is yes. There's quite a few women publishers and quite a few that were very instrumental in the printmaking renaissance. I'm thinking in particular June Wayne and Catherine Brown. So June Wayne of the Tamron Institute and Catherine Brown of Crown Point Press were two pioneering women of the earlier days of the printmaking renaissance of the 60s and 70s. And, you know, jumping forward to today, there are also lots of other female printers and publishers. You know, I'm thinking May Shore is on here tonight, you know, so yes, there are. I think there can always be more. And, you know, from a printer or publisher's perspective, the more diversity and voices and different perspectives of people who are publishing, you know, the ones who are picking what gets made, the better work we'll have out there pushing all of us to do different things and to do more. And we'll have a better record of our time, the more voices that are included in that conversation. So, you know, to any publishers are out there, I'm always encouraging you to look towards people you wouldn't normally look to, you know, to expand your view of who you should put your effort and your money behind. Because, you know, I think that was one of the things that Hieronymus Koch did really well for his time, was selecting his artists, you know, that would have value. Is there, for you, are there other artists that we should mention to people that he was working with that they may or may not know about?
Well, those were the two main. There's another pair that I could mention. One of the artists is Martin van Heemskerk. He was a Dutch artist coming from Haarlem, and he had sort of a career. He was a painter. You see his paintings a lot. He went down to Rome, came back to the Netherlands. He was like one of the first Northern artists to go down to Rome. Comes back like totally wild about Michelangelo, and like all of his paintings have these big muscly guys in them. And he teams up with this printmaker named Dirk Volkerts Kornhert. And Kornhert was kind of like an incredible, he was a philosopher, he was a theologian, he did all kinds of things, and he was a printman etcher and a printmaker. And so the two of them kind of teamed up together up in Haarlem, and they started making prints. And, you know, and it seems like Kornhert was the idea man, right? He was the one who was the theologian, the philosopher, etc. Then he would get work with Heemskerk. Heemskerk would do the drawing. He would be the vision guy. So he would have all of his incredible muscly figures, and then Kornhert would make the print. So it was this incredible teamwork, the two of them working together, producing like hundreds of prints. Hieronymus Koch gets wind of what's going on. So he's down in Antwerp. Haarlem is up in, you know, present day Holland. He sees what's going on and is like, oh, I got to get these guys working for me. So he sort of pulls them in and starts getting them to produce prints for his publishing company. So at first they're sort of publishing stuff on their own, but he, you know, he's got the range, he's got the you know, he's the big guy in the Netherlands, and so they start working for him, and then Kornhert starts doing prints after other artists that Koch is working with. So that's an interesting kind of spin on what he does. So he's clearly like looking to see what's out there. And then the other thing I should say is, you can tell in Antwerp there are other little print publishers working all around, and so you know, Hieronymus Koch is kind of representative of one kind of publisher, but just like today, there are people who do, you know, as Gemini, and then there's, you know, other little people who are also working and do, you know, and they all have their different interests, and it was exactly the same thing at that time. People had different public. There was one print publisher named Bartholomeus de Mumper, who only most of all the prints he published are dated 1559. He seemed to have like this moment where he decided, and they're all huge. I mean, he wasn't thinking small. He started making really big prints all in 1559 with these etchers who could make big prints, and they're sort of related to things Bruegel was doing and other artists. And then, like, that's the last you hear of him. I don't know what happened to him, but he's to me, he's like such a fascinating figure because he clearly had big ambitions and then just sort of disappears. And then his son becomes a very famous painter later on.
Yeah, it makes, same thing happens in print publishing today. You'll get someone who starts something, does some amazing things, and then they disappear. And I have to say that it's a really hard business to be in. It requires so much of so many different people to be able to work together in order to produce something that can then be financially viable for all the parties involved. And it's pretty easy to get over ambitious and as a result basically make it a losing financial proposition because the costs of prints are just not high enough necessarily to take too many risks. And so sometimes you can see people definitely overshoot an ambition. It's definitely a hard thing. I know as a printer it's always really hard to think of anything other than the work you're trying to help your artist make, right? Because that's the thing you care about the most. And then in the back of your mind, you have to be thinking, well, if I make this and it's going to take us 2 years to finish it, are we going to go bankrupt before we ever have anything available to be sold? And that's one of the things I always love to put out there about contemporary print publishing. And like, this is a great example. You had mentioned David Kroot as kind of being the Hieronymus Koch of today. From South Africa, and one of the things that I think about is his dedication to the Triumphs and Laments woodcut series, which, I think they're going on 6 years now of that particular project, of all of the expense of keeping everybody employed to keep working on all of that, all to produce that work, just to finish the editioning so you do have something you can sell in the end. It requires so much up front. That you really do have to believe in that work and that artist in order to really get that across the finish line. And I think for me, when I look at the work that Hieronymus Koch was doing he was publishing a lot of stuff that he thought maybe would sell or would do these things, but his dedication to pairing the right people together really does demonstrate that he actually really loved the work too. That he had a great deal of respect for the art and the artist in order to be like, well, this is what you're good at and this is what you're good at. So I'm going to put you together so you work to your strengths versus just saying, oh, let's put anything out. It really, I think, does highlight that particular aspect of him as a publisher.
Yeah, but I like your take on Bartholomeus de Montfort. I think he was just too ambitious and he decided to do all these huge prints in 1 year. And then didn't work so well.
Yeah, it didn't work out. I can totally sympathize with that. Because especially if he sees what's capable, if he's looking to Hieronymus Koch as being like, that's the guy, that's gonna be my competition.
He's clearly doing the same stuff, and it was like, or you wonder, Hieronymus Koch sort of saw what was going on and somehow like put the screws to him.
Shut it down.
Yeah.
This is where the creative nonfiction element.
Yeah. Been watching too much TV cop shows.
So there's an interesting question that came through that was I'll just read it off. What role did prints play in collections in the 16th and 17th century? And it says they were assuming they were not framed and hung on the wall. They were wondering how people thought of them and considered them. And did they consider them as standalone works? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, some prints were hung on the wall. We definitely have evidence of that from the 16th and 17th century. You see, in images, you see like print, pasted on something, or definitely people use prints as wallpaper. They use prints as decorations of different kinds. But certainly if you had like definitely in the 17th century, if you had an image of the stadtholder, who was sort of like, one of the rulers of the time, people had those hanging in their homes. Sometimes they'd be printed on silk for very special publications that would be given to, the states, the sort of the regents of Holland, or, some very special people. But mostly prints were kept in albums or in books, or they were sort of stored away in portfolios, and so you see them sometimes bound together. Books at the time didn't really come bound, or they came bound in very soft, maybe calf bindings, but a special binding, the owner would get them bound themselves. But by the 17th century, there were people who were making like big collections of prints that would be organized by subject matter, or certainly by famous artists. So someone might have an album of Parmigianino prints, an album of Rembrandt prints, and then an album of views of Rome, album of landscapes, which would just have all kinds of stuff in it. And like one of the reasons you see a lot of prints have almost no margin around them, old master prints, is that they would cut off all the extra paper so they could put as many things on one page as possible, gluing them in to their albums. So that's one of the things you think.
Scrapbooking your Durs.
Yeah, well, yeah. Definitely in the 18th century, there are big British collections which have like the Dürer album and lots of prints. Or, we have at the Met a Parmigianino album from Wilton House in England, and it's just got, at least on every, these prints are pretty on the small side, but it's got, 6 or 7, potentially 15 prints on one sheet. And sometimes they're by Parmigianino, after Parmigianino. They weren't like specific about what they were putting into these albums. If you go to the Uffizi, they've got their original collection is in albums, and you see Hieronymus Koch prints that must have been flown straight down to Italy. They're so rich and fresh. When I was working on Bruegel, I was down there, and like I could not believe how what these impressions look like. They were beautiful and looked like they had been stuck in the album, closed the album, and that's the last time anybody looked at them. They were amazing. So people, but that was it. But those were in a big album of just like landscapes and then some other things. There's a famous collection in Germany, the name just flew out of my head, but there you can go, if you get permission, you can visit this basically a 17th century collection built up around 1650. Oh my God, the name is like right in like just beyond my brain. And anyway, but there you can go through, they have just like 50, 60 albums or more of one album is just virgins, and it's got like French ones, German ones, Italian ones, prints. It's all prints. Another album is, sort of genre scenes, so scenes of everyday life, and you get like French things, Italian things. And this guy was clearly buying in bulk because you get the same print showing up in lots of different subject categories, and then you'll get an album of Rembrandt. So they do both.
Right. So I think that's what's really kind of fascinating about that was there was kind of name recognition and value, and then there was kind of more aesthetic categories. And you see a lot of that same collecting habit today. Like people are like, well, I'm going to collect this artist because they're great, or I've been told X, Y, or Z, and then I'm also going to collect all these other things, so it's almost like having the art collection mixed with your baseball card collection or something like that. And, just the habits of how people look at things and how they value things. One of the things I think is really fascinating is that you're saying that, there's these Hieronymus Koch prints that went straight down like to Uffizi. So he must have had a series of really good collectors that he was pipelining stuff to immediately in that sort of a way, which, really tells you why he was successful. He was good at networking and finding these good collections for his work to go to, or helping to build some of those collections, especially since they were buying the work but not necessarily quote unquote using it. Like they were literally buying it for the owning of it, the collecting aspect of it.
Yeah.
To be able to have
Well,
impressions that clean.
yeah, I mean, he clearly started off being inspired by the publishers who were active in Rome. He clearly knew about, even if he hadn't gone to Rome, he clearly was aware of what was going on down there, because there were a lot of people making prints, not in as like specific a way as he was. But then, so he clearly has lots of ties back and forth at Rome. So things, artists are going down there, or coming up to him, he's going down there. There's a lot of back and forth there.
Right. And I think it's just something like for us today, when we think about how information and people traveled in that period of time, we don't necessarily think about it being this constant free flow. But when you really start to look at how images were being moved about and how quickly and consistently, there really was a lot more of that free flow of travel, even if it's just in ideas, at that point.
Yeah, well, when you get to the next century, there's an artist named Hendrik Goltzius, who's a well-known Mannerist printmaker, and he's living in Haarlem, and his prints are being copied like the year after they're made by Italian kind of knockoff engravers, like not even the best ones. So clearly his stuff is like shooting down there and circulating so much that these guys who are not even that good are making copies after his work.
And the work must have been that popular, like from the artist's perspective. Like we could all think of artists today that, they make something and there's like a whole bunch of knockoffs being made right away because people want it, you could sell it.
Right.
So, I mean, it's interesting. It's fascinating to think about the parallels of the art market and the art world of then to today, and how not that much of it's really changed, and I think for us, when we talk about it and we talk about the publishing model of today versus then, and how so much of it is so similar, in some ways it's, you think, well, isn't there something that we should do to innovate with, the field as publishers? But on some level, you're like, well, it's been working for 500 years. So
Well,
I don't know.
Things haven't changed. You need to make money. You've got people, you're making things on paper. It's like, well, how much can you do?
Exactly. Yeah. So when you think about it, there's a comfort in knowing that it's kind of time tested. So, he did it at the beginning, and really kind of opens that up for people to really have those different tiers in the publishing world, which I think was it's a really good point that you made, that, he was working at the high level. And then there's other things happening. There's like artists who are self-publishing, and then there's smaller publishers who are really working towards a different marketplace. And then there's stuff that's even more kind of just for the masses, mass production stuff. And that he really kind of created that market and that concept of how we do it, which is where a lot of us, work in the art world today, is in that market. And, and we make work for the museum community, for, places like the Met, which is what he was doing at his time period. He was making stuff for those kind of museum-y collections of the time. So this has been really fun, and I think we could probably talk for hours, but if there aren't any other questions, we should probably let you guys go for the evening, and really appreciate you sticking with us and having some fun. And I put in the chat, I put some contact information for Lynn and for Nadine on Instagram and stuff, and some for me. We're all out there and accessible. And I do want to make the point that the Met's collection is one of the great publicly accessible collections in the United States, and that it's the work is available to be seen. You can make appointments and you can see some of this
not
work
right now.
Not
We're
right
still
now.
closed.
I should qualify. We got the COVID problems, but
Maybe in the fall, we hope, but we have quite a lot available on our website you can look at. So,
and I have to say, as someone who's just written a book on printmaking, the Met's website was such a great resource to be able to find really great work and images. You guys have been working really hard to digitize, so much of the collection, and it really shows, and it's helpful for people like myself. But yeah, I do love the print study room is one of the, it's like the best secret door to go into, because it's like this hidden little door. All of a sudden you're like, oh, that's a door over there. And you go into this other world where, centuries of amazing work and things to be discovered are held and housed. And I mean, you have several million pieces of paper back there, right? You're a couple million.
Million and a half, we say, million and a half. But we don't know. We have a big collection of baseball cards, among other things. So that's part of the reason we don't know.
No, exactly. But and it's wonderful too. You've got plates and blocks and a lot of that stuff that really helps artists and collectors and like.
One other plug I should say is right now we have a very nice rotation in our gallery about images of New York, but the next one that goes up, I believe the end of April, is all about materials and techniques. So it's going to look at different kinds of techniques of drawing and print, and it's going to have actual like tools and things like that in the show. So that's if you're interested in that kind of thing. And we also have on our website a really good feature called Materials and Techniques of Drawings and Prints. And it really goes into like how you make different kinds of prints and shows you how it's done. It's really good.
Yeah, they're not only is it informative, they're entertaining as well. So not gonna lie. There was one question that came in, and it's from Nick Naughton from the Printcast. It says, for tracking a particular print in collections, is there a way to find every collector and or owner of a particular print? Like, how do you guys do that?
It's no, basically we're the generation, I always say, of the people putting stuff online. The next generation will be able to benefit from that. But different museums are at really very different levels of like how much they've got online. So the British Museum, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam really made a big effort putting most of their prints online, but and I don't actually, Rijksmuseum, I'm not even sure they have like the Italian or the French stuff up. They really put all the Dutch things up. We're still working on getting a lot out, and we're doing pretty well, but there are lots of other places like little German museums or big German museums have done almost nothing or aren't sharing the stuff that they've done. Let's put it that way. So it's really like hunting around to find things.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I really appreciate about searching the collection online for the Met is that it is really about making it publicly accessible. It's super accessible. There's a lot of information on it. And it really kind of helps you, go down a wormhole of a particular artist or a period of time. So yeah, I personally really appreciated, using that as a resource when I couldn't be there all the time.
But really, it's only a fraction of what we have. Yeah, it's only a fraction of what we have that's online right now. So don't, if you don't find something, it doesn't mean we don't have it. It's just that it may not be there yet.
Right. I love your guys' card catalog. And it's like and it's like there's only like how far you're in on getting it all digitized. It's like this massive card catalog, and there's not that many boxes. It kind of gives people the understanding of how much there is to do in that regard. But again, I want to say thank you again, Nadine, for your time, and Lynn, if you're still on there, I can't see you right now. Thank you as well, and by all means, stay connected to everyone and reach out. Lynn has a lot of stuff going on. She's an artist who's got her hands in lots of pots and helping lots of other artists out as well. So by all means, look up the work, hit up her website, check out what she's got going on. And Flying Horse and Tamarin both have fairly new editions. The edition that's in my book of Lynn's is from the Tamarin Institute, and the newest stuff's with Flying Horse. So please keep up to date, and we'll see you back here again in 2 weeks' time for the next episode. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Phil. This was great.
It was a lot of fun.